So a man walks into a bar and vanishes into thin air. Yeah, I thought that was a pretty bad joke myself, until I realised it wasn't one. Oh boy. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking into the mysterious case of Brian Shaffer, who disappeared in a bar back in 2006, and still to this day, hasn't been found. So grab a coffee, sit back and relax. Let's investigate. Our story begins in Ohio, with a man named Brian Shaffer. Brian was born on the 25th of February 1979 and grew up in Pickerington, Ohio, with his parents Randy and Renee Shaffer and his brother Derek. He graduated from his local high school in 1997, where he then enrolled into Ohio State University as an undergraduate to study medicines. Brian was well-natured, smart and hard-working, and he also had a creative side. He loved to play the guitar, and he really enjoyed his tropical holidays. While at Ohio State University, Brian met and fell in love with his girlfriend, Alexis Wagner, who he adored very much. Fast forward, and it is now March the 31st, 2006. It was a Friday, and classes had broken up for spring break. Brian had just completed his second year, studying his bachelor's in microbiology. To celebrate this, Brian had scheduled a night out with his friends. But before this, he promised his father to meet at a local steakhouse for dinner. Randy and Brian always had a great bond as father and son, but they'd grown even closer following the tragic loss of mother Renee Shaffer, who passed away from a rare form of bone cancer just 3 weeks earlier. This really devastated the two, along with brother Derek, but the three were finding comfort and support from each other. During dinner, Randy noticed that Brian looked exhausted, probably from the long streak of all-nighters that he was doing in the previous weeks to keep up with his exams. But despite this, Brian still planned to go out with his friends for drinks. I mean, come on, who wouldn't? So at about 9 PM, Brian said goodbye to his dad, and he met up with his friend William Clint Florence at a bar nearby on High Street. He and Clint, they slowly worked their way from bar to bar, taking one shot of hard liquor at a time, towards the Arena district of Columbus. And just after midnight, while still drinking, the two met up with Clint's friend Meredith Reed. Meredith gave the two a lift to a local bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona, nice name, and joined them for their final drink there. The last drink started off no different than any other. The three mingled with friends around them, and enjoyed music coming from the live band next to them. Drinks were flowing, conversations were swirling, and the next thing they knew, Clint and Reed couldn't find Brian. They checked the bar, checked the toilets, checked outside. He wasn't there. Now, it wasn't unusual for Brian to disappear after one drink or four, but the two tried to find him nevertheless. They even repeatedly called and texted his mobile phone to see if they could get a hold of him. But it was now 2 AM and the bar was closing, and after waiting for Brian outside for a while, they figured that he'd just gone home without warning them. So the two went home as well. The next morning, Brian's girlfriend, Alexis, tried to call his mobile, but the call went through straight to voicemail. No worries, she thought, he's probably sleeping off a hangover. Brian's dad tried to call him shortly after, but just like everyone else, voicemail. Morning turned to afternoon, afternoon turned to evening, and Alex's worries were starting to grow even more. Her and Brian had planned to go to Miami just 2 days later, and she was excited about the trip. It was also very unusual for Brian not to message or call back. That's not really in his nature. 2 days later, and the moment finally arrived. Alex packed her bags, went to the airport, flight ticket in hand, and waited for Brian. But Brian's silence did not change. He never showed up. He missed his flight, and so did she. It was at that moment that both Alex and Randy were really worried for Brian. They called the police and filed a missing persons report. Police began their search very quickly at the last place Brian was seen, the Ugly Tuna Saloona. The local area had seen crime rates rise in the last few months, so luckily, the bar had a couple security cameras. When police reviewed the surveillance footage overlooking the bar's only entrance, there they found Brian, Clint, and Reed. Brian's shave was close, his hair was neatly combed, his jeans and his olive t-shirt were well fitted. Footage showed the three going up an escalator to the bar's main entrance at 1:15 AM. Brian was again seen outside of the bar at 1:55 AM, talking briefly with two young women before saying his goodbyes and moving off camera, most likely in the direction back to the bar. That was in fact the last time Brian was ever seen, because oddly enough the camera never picked up Brian leaving the Ugly Tuna later on when the bar closed. What's even more odd is that this was Brian's only plausible exit. The bar was on the second floor, and the only entrance was by an escalator in which the camera guarded. There was one other possible exit, however, a service door, but not only was the door banned from public use, it also opened up to a construction site, which would have been extremely difficult for anyone to manoeuvre through, even when sober. So the Ugly Tuna Saloona and the building it was situated in was relatively new. The building was only constructed about a year prior, and while the bar itself was complete and in function, the rest of the building's interior was still steel and concrete. Police reviewing the footage along with the bar's staff counted the number of people entering and exiting the bar throughout the night. The final count, however, would equal one less when leaving. This means that even if Brian had disguised himself, he still would have been accounted for by the camera. More disturbingly, it meant that he would have left by himself. Otherwise, there would be -2 on the count. So the location that the Ugly Tuna was in had a lot of public security cameras. This gave the police a head start on trying to see if they could find Brian later on in that evening. However, after reviewing hundreds of hours from footage in the local area, no sighting of Brian was ever made. Police investigating the case found that the last signal to Brian's phone was made at around about 2:10 AM, when Clint made a text message to him asking him where he was. Search efforts spread out far and wide from the Ugly Tuna Saloona, with officers and police dogs looking through the streets, inspecting dumpsters and waste containers, interviewing local residents, and even checking the city's sewer system. Unfortunately though, no useful information was ever discovered. Brian's apartment was about 6 blocks away from the Ugly Tuna on King Avenue. There, police found his car still parked outside, and in the property nothing was amiss. His bed was found neatly tucked, all clothes and personal items accounted for. Police searched for miles in every direction of the bar, and no clues ever showed up. They began to speculate if maybe he'd run away to grieve for his mother that just passed 25 days before. But then again, if he did do this, in which there was no sign he was intending to, how did he leave the bar, and why so abstractly? Everyone who had seen Brian that evening was asked to take a lie detector test, and while all that took it passed, it was noted that Clint refused to take the test. We'll get to that later. Brian Shaffer's disappearance seemed permanent though, but no sufficient evidence or reason for his disappearance ever showed up. After months of no leads or evidence, the case started to cool down. But Brian's girlfriend Alex, she still waited for him to return. Every night, for her own comfort, she would call Brian's mobile phone, just to listen to his voice. But she would also call just to check to see if his phone ever turned back on. And then one night, as Alex got into bed in September 2006, she did her usual, got into bed, called his mobile, and it rang. Alex, she couldn't believe it. So she called it a second time, and it rang, and then a third time, and it rang. So she called the police, they too rang his phone, it rang once, and then hung up. When they tried a second time, it went through straight to voicemail. They did, however, manage to trace the phone signal during the time that it rang the first time. The phone's ping was located to a cell tower 23 kilometers northwest of Columbus, Ohio. However, Brian's phone didn't have any GPS capability, so that's as far as they'd ever got. Nothing came from this phone call, and Brian's mobile phone operator Singular said that it very well could have been a glitch. Nothing more materialized from the phone or from Brian, and here the case officially went cold. Randy Shaffer, having lost his wife just 3 weeks before losing contact with his son, relentlessly searched for Brian. He never gave up hope, and he made hundreds of friends along the way. That was until September the 14th, 2008. Hurricane Ook was sweeping through Ohio, which was experiencing exceptionally heavy storms throughout. Randy was at his home in Baltimore, walking to his shed while clearing up debris in the back garden, when the limb of a nearby tree was ripped from its trunk. The large branch struck Andy, fatally wounding him. Neighbours would find him dead in his garden the next morning. He was only one of 6 to die in that hurricane. Whew, what a freak accident. So, what happened to Brian Shaffer? With Randy dead and Alex moving on, efforts into the case of Brian's disappearance naturally depleted over the years. We still don't know what happened to him to this day. There are, however, a few theories out there. One main thought is that Brian could have left his life to start a new one. Following his mother's death, Brian was devastated. Her funeral was only 3 weeks before he disappeared. Brian was also questioning his career path shortly before he disappeared. He wrote on his MySpace profile,
"I really love music, and this whole doctor thing is really just a job, only temporary, until I get my band together and put out a record. I want to own an island someday, or at least a beach so I can listen to Buffett all day and drink margaritas with my senorita."
So maybe along with the devastating news, life's too short after all, Brian decided to quit his current life and start a new one, doing what he wanted to do. Although this is possible, Alex, Randy and Derek all believed that Brian had too much of a heart to just up and go without saying goodbye. It also doesn't explain why he decided to avoid the bar's main entrance. He could have just disguised himself on the way out. Detective Andrew Edwards, who also investigated the possibility that Brian changed his clothes and left the ugly tuna undetected, said he could say with 100% certainty that Brian did not leave via the escalator. The next most supported theory is that Brian tried to leave the bar via the service door, and while in the construction area became trapped and died there. We know that on the night Brian disappeared, the rest of the building was still under construction, and while the building did have a back exit, it would have been extremely difficult to find his way out even without several drinks beforehand. Brian's friends also tried to call him only minutes after he disappeared. Within those minutes, Brian was already ignoring their calls. It was unusual for Brian to do this, and so, if he was already in trouble, hence ignoring the phone calls, chances are that he was still in the building. It's very unlikely that he would have had the time to make his way across the construction site. So that supports this theory. Police were also very vague with questions directed towards when the construction site was searched. And still, to this day, they refuse to share their leading theories as to what happened to Brian. Could Brian have slipped through the cracks and been buried by cement? Maybe. Another theory is that Brian could have left the ugly tuna and died later on. However, Brian's body, his clothes, his wallet and his phone, all of them, they were never found. Columbus is also a very densely populated area, which means that if he was murdered, his body would most likely show up, and it never did. It's also very rare for a spontaneous killer to conceal or hide a body, and all of Brian's friends had been accounted for and passed a polygraph test. That is, apart from one. And this leads us to our last theory. Was Clint involved in Brian's disappearance? Clint was the only person to have spent the entire night with Brian, and he was also a good friend of his. So it's likely that if Brian had plans to get away, he would have told Clint that night. Clint also confirmed to police, along with other witnesses, that he and Brian had a verbal altercation on the night that he disappeared. So, was Clint angry at Brian? Now, we already know that Clint refused to take a polygraph test, but to add to further suspicion, he lawyered up as soon as he was requested to take one. He also cut all communication with friends and acquaintances of Brian after that moment. What was Clint hiding? Potentially nothing. Polygraph tests are notorious for sometimes being inaccurate. Clint was also speculated to be taking drugs around the time Brian disappeared. It's understandable that he may have wanted to steer clear of a polygraph and any damning evidence of him taking drugs to protect his career path in the future. So who knows? Brian's brother, Derek, believes that Clint knows something, but Clint ain't talking. And that's all we have on the Brian Shaffer case. It's impossible to tell which theory remains closest to the truth, or even what happened to Brian Shaffer at all. Friends and family that were close to Brian still hope that one day he'll return, but with every year that passes, that dream looks less likely. Police formally believe that Brian is still out there, somewhere, alive, but friends and family that were close to Brian still believe he had too much of a heart to go without saying goodbye. And if you ask me, I have no idea. I think I'd like to know more about the construction site. get some ground-penetrating radar on the walls and the floors, just to make sure he's not in there. I can't see how he got away. If he did though, come back, Brian. I'm sure the Secret Service would love your sneaky skills. And the rule of the story, folks, is look after your drunk friends. We all have one that likes to sneak away at the end of the night. You know who you are. Hello there, and thank you so much for watching another video of mine. If you enjoyed this case, please hang around for more, hit the subscribe button, and give this video a like. What do you think happened to Brian Shaffer? Do you think he left the bar? Do you think he's still there to this day? Let me know in the comments below and I'll get back to you. Thank you again once more, and I'll see you in the next video. Look after each other. Goodbye.